We all know the story. When the Romans successfully invaded Britain in the middle of the 1st century AD, their military might pushed relentlessly north, conquering as they went before coming to a standstill at the edge of Scotland. Staring out across this uncharted landscape, hearing terrible tales of the belligerent tribes who occupied it, they decided enough was enough. Hadrian built his Great Wall and the Roman Empire ended. Although that's not actually what happened. Hadrian's Wall was great, but it was not the end of the story. Because the Romans didn't stop their advance. In fact, they occupied the southern half of what is now Scotland. And that's why we're here, 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall, between Glasgow and Edinburgh. This is where the Romans began building a new wall, named the Antonine Wall, after the new emperor, Antoninus Pius. This was a coast-to-coast border, the most northerly outpost of the whole Roman Empire, and yet, for such a breathtaking endeavour, it remains relatively unknown. I think it's so interesting that it's become this kind of urban myth that the Romans never actually made it into what is now modern-day Scotland. You know, they got as far as the Hadrian's Wall and then that's it. That's the end of empire.
And in terms of evidence, we need look no further than what we're standing in. This huge, great ditch gouged through the Scots countryside. Glasgow over there, right to Edinburgh over there. Incredible construction effort.
How do you know this is Rome? I mean, what does this say to you that tells it was made by the Romans?
Well, it has that ruthless quality, doesn't it? And this is straight across the countryside, ploughing through everything. And there's this air of thought about it, design. You know, this is classic engineering, Roman engineering.
And the scale of it is very Roman, isn't it? I mean, the Romans are nothing if not ambitious. And this goes from one coast to the other.
I mean, that's it. I mean, when they decide to do something, they don't do it by halves, do they?
What's most mystifying about this massive statement of Roman military power is that within 2 decades of being built, it was quietly abandoned, decommissioned and left to crumble. So what went wrong? To get to the bottom of this mystery, Ben needs to get his eye in the sky, which is where our brilliant octocopter comes into play.
That's right, I love the way the legs go up, that's fantastic. Yeah.
It's the chance for Ben to see this remarkable structure from above, giving him a much clearer picture of what the Romans were trying to achieve with this wall. And to help him make sense of it, he's been joined by aerial archaeologist Rebecca Jones.
And you can see this is cutting right across the landscape, isn't it? Of course, it's known as the Antonine Wall, but the most obvious feature is this great ditch gouging through the countryside.
That's right, in a lot of places it's the ditch that survives, it's what you can see. We probably should call it the Antonine Ditch, but...
There was a wall.
There was a wall.
It wasn't a stone wall, it was a wall built of turf.
That's right. I mean, the ditch itself was up to 12 metres wide and 4.5 metres deep. But then behind it, you had a stone footing with drains through it, and on top of that, you had a turf wall, which was turf edged in places, and it had clay edges in parts of it. But it was a formidable wall. It stood up to 3 metres high, potentially with a timber sort of fence along the top. So this is not some minor turf wall. This was an important frontier making a statement.
This was the edge of the empire, the final frontier.
Close on 2,000 years of erosion have taken their toll on the turf wall. But as Ben and Rebecca move further east to a site known as Roughcastle, the aerial camera clearly shows that what remains is much more than just a straightforward fortification.
I can see layers of defences, some very curious little holes appearing now.
That's right, these are the defensive pits to the north. There would have been more of them than the ones you can see just here, and we have found them at multiple places on the wall now.
These innocuous-looking pits are the excavated remains of a vicious Roman booby trap, known as Lilia. Originally, they'd have been covered in bracken, concealing a very nasty surprise for anyone who dared to attack. Why are they called Lilia? Because that means lilies in Latin, so it's a kind of nice
It does indeed.
name.
It's a wonderful nickname that the army of Caesar used. The pit is the shape of the petals of the flower, and the spikes are the stamen. And each one is an oval pit, about 40 centimetres deep. Originally, they would have had 2 wooden spikes, one at either end, pointed, fire hardened so the point doesn't disappear, probably smeared with animal fat, so that if you accidentally grazed yourself, never mind skewered yourself on them, the wound would turn septic and you'd die in agony.
Wow.
The Lilia are just the first in row upon row of intimidating defences on the enemy side of the Antonine Wall. And archaeologists have discovered that the Romans used every trick in the book to stop a hostile invading force reaching them.
This is made from the earth dug from the ditch, so it's piled high. And on this side there would have been loose scree, boulders and things like that. So you're kind of slipping as you go up the slope. And then as you reach the lip here, suddenly you're silhouetted against the skyline and the garrison spot you.
So this is not something you'd want to do during the day?
You're better off doing it under cover of darkness in terms of the Roman sentries, but then you wouldn't see this. I mean, this is an absolutely massive ditch, some 30 feet across, 16 feet deep originally.
What happens at the bottom?
In the bottom of the V-shaped ditch, there's an ankle-breaking slot, which is about 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep. But it seems to be, in fact, that's where they embedded the broken branches or the hawthorn hedge that they would have put in the bottom.
I mean, hawthorn, once you get that stuck in you, it's impossible to get out. It's kind of like the equivalent of Roman barbed wire.
These killing zones make one thing crystal clear. The Romans did not think the locals were a pushover. All this begs the question, who exactly is scared of whom? With basic tools, it must have taken thousands of soldiers and slaves to furiously dig the ditch, build the wall, and lay the traps that spanned its 40-mile frontier. This is a bit of Rome that was definitely not built in one day. But Hadrian's already constructed a massive stone defence, so why bother with a new wall at all? Well, there may be a clue amongst the finds and replicas on display at the Hadrian Museum in Glasgow. They have an impressive collection of inscribed stone slabs, unearthed from along the length of the wall. This is seriously impressive. Beautifully decorated, but I imagine it's not just for decoration, it must have a job of work to do.
Yeah. This is one of the distance slabs which was set up on the line of the Antonine Wall, and the inscription in the centre is telling us that in honour of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, one of the legions of the garrison of Britain has completed an exact distance of 4,652 paces of the Antonine Wall.
So it's almost the kind of Roman soldiers celebrating themselves and the fact that they've done this for all the kind of blood, sweat and tears of building the thing. And then what are the pictures telling us?
On the left-hand side of the stone here, a Roman cavalryman is shown riding down a group of rather disconsolate-looking local tribesmen who've clearly been defeated by the strength of the Roman army. But it's all part of the sort of propaganda, more or less what it is.
Word of mouth is so important. I mean, this is how you get this message out.
You can't see it on your television screen.
No, exactly.
This whole wall was belligerent PR for the new emperor, Antoninus Pius. A message to the Romans and locals alike that crowed, "Look at me, I'm supremely powerful and I've expanded our empire."
Antoninus has just succeeded Hadrian, who was a very successful emperor and successful militarily. But Antoninus has no military background or experience at all, and I think he wanted to open his reign, inaugurate the new reign with a bit of foreign policy success, which would be commemorated in Rome and, of course, also on the new frontier line itself.
We're in charge, we've drawn a new line in the map, and you don't mess with us.
So, the wall in all its glory may have been a quick way for the new emperor, Antoninus, to earn his military credentials. But vanity project or not, this was an impressive feat of construction with state-of-the-art defences. And yet, it lasted a mere 20 years. So can Ben's eye in the sky reveal why it was suddenly abandoned?
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's excellent.
This is the Antonine Wall, built by a Roman emperor intent on proving his military prowess. It was a fearsome defence which marked the northern limit of the Roman Empire. And yet, it was almost immediately abandoned as the army retreated 100 miles south to Hadrian's Wall. So now we're trying to work out exactly why this whole project was deliberately shut down just 20 years after it had been started. Because a huge amount of effort went into building this. We're not just talking about the wall. Punched along its length are numerous forts and fortlets. Some are well preserved, like this one at Bar Hill. Others are lost under bracken or trees. And Ben is now at Rough Castle, where he's fascinated by the grass-covered lumps and bumps.
We can see the whole thing now. That's absolutely perfect. This is a fantastic example of a Roman fort. You've got the ditch out in the front there, and then there would have been the bank of the Antonine Wall, and built into that would have been the fort proper. And it's got that classic rounded corner playing card shape to it.
You can see that it's one of the smaller forts on the wall because you're seeing it so clearly in this shot.
It's small, but it's perfectly formed, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I can see there's humps and bumps on the interior. I mean, these look like the foundations of buildings to me, and a lot of buildings.
That's right, you've got a Roman road running through the centre of the fort. We've got the commanding officer's house, we've got a granary, we've got the headquarters building, bits of barracks, all the classic features you would expect to get in a Roman fort.
Yeah.
Thousands of soldiers would have been stationed in these forts right along the length of the wall. But holding back the enemy was only one part of a successful Roman frontier. Keeping your soldiers happy and in line was also vital. And Ben has spotted some intriguing features.
Looking down there, right next to the fort, and partly under the trees there, is this annex. It's not the fort itself, it's additional to the fort. And we don't really know what the purpose of these was. And right at the heart of the annex, maybe a bathhouse. It was somewhere for the soldiers to relax.
The annex at Rough Castle is covered in grass and trees, making it virtually impossible for Ben to pick out the bathhouse. But these buildings were central to Roman culture, and bathhouses have been excavated right along the length of the wall. But one of the most spectacular is here, on the outskirts of a very rainy Glasgow. Well, and how perfect for those Roman soldiers to have worked out that even on a lovely summer's day like this, it would be a very good idea in Britain to have a hot room and somewhere you could go for a hot bath. Under these remarkable remains was found a cesspit and that most precious of relics, poo, the contents of which were analysed by the team headed up by archaeologist David Breeze. Did that mean there was rich pickings here for you as an archaeologist?
There were. We didn't realise this at first because we found the sewage from the latrine before we found the latrine. So we now know they ate wheat, barley, but also other food which comes from abroad. So we have fig seeds, opium poppy, coriander, which is almost certainly coming from the continent. So here we are at the very edge of the empire with at the tip of an enormous supply chain.
That's such a vivid picture. So not only do you have men who've come from all corners of the Roman Empire, so from North Africa, from the Middle East, from Central Europe itself, they're also being nourished and sustained by the produce of the known world. And,
Yes.
and knowing the Romans as I do, I bet it was all absolutely organised down to the last grain of macaroni wheat.
Yeah.
It's becoming clear that supplying the Antonine Wall was a mammoth operation. There are more remnants of its foundations nearby, at New Kilpatrick Cemetery. I'm standing above the exposed remains now, and here I am 1,500 miles away from Rome. Back then, there would have been 8,000 soldiers on this wall alone, 20,000 more in the region, and all of them supported by a supply chain of farmers and merchants and pen pushers and security. Now, that is a lot of effort to defend a single boundary against a few restless tribes. It certainly seems they took the threat of aggression seriously. There's a precious map that gives us an incredibly clear view of just how much effort went into defending this frontier.
To lay it out here as well.
It was drawn up in 1755, a time when this stretch of Scotland was far less developed. It's the work of military surveyor General William Roy, the man who pioneered Ordnance Survey maps.
So it's thanks to him we have this wonderful early plan of the entire length of the Antonine Wall, from coast to coast. Just remarkable. And in detail, he's plotted each of the forts that could be seen at the time.
What you really get the sense of here, looking at this though, is just how many forts you've got on this wall.
Absolutely. There's at least 17, but there's probably more out there.
Amazing. And that's 17 on the kind of 40 miles or so of the Antonine Wall, but you've got a similar number on Hadrian's Wall, which is double the length.
This seems to be a much more densely defended wall than Hadrian's Wall.
What's more, recent digs by Glasgow University have found that some of these forts were built after the wall went up, suggesting that the Romans had to reinforce their new flagship frontier, having underestimated the wrath of the locals.
You really realise just how intimidating this would have been, because this is this kind of brutal scar of control that's suddenly emerging in the landscape.
Well, suddenly you're in a military zone.
Yeah.
The countryside that you knew and grew up with and your ancestors grew up with has just changed, and you're either on one side or the other.
Yes.
And that must have been a remarkably severe feeling at the time, you know, this sort of brutal act of partition.
But even though it was now the most heavily fortified frontier of the empire, the future of the Antonine Wall was anything but secure.
It looks like events just conspired against the Antonine Wall. It sat right at the end of an expensive supply chain that stretched empire-wide. And yet, the Roman legions still didn't seem to be in full control of the local populations in Scotland. The emperor who'd commissioned it, Antoninus, was dying. And then, to top it all, the turf wall, which had been standing for 20 years, was looking like it needed rebuilding in some places. The question had to be asked, was the Antonine Wall worth all this effort?
A collection of coins at the National Museum of Scotland implies that the answer was no.
Well, that looks like a good hoard to me.
Yeah, this is the biggest coin hoard from Roman Scotland. This is over 1,900 silver coins found near the Antonine Wall at Falkirk. I call it a Roman hoard, but it's come into local hands. And a lot of these things are essentially bribes.
It seems the Romans decided that paying the locals, rather than fighting them, was a much cheaper way of keeping northern Britannia in check.
That tells us that these are troublesome people. These are people you have to try to keep on your side.
This looks dramatic. You look at this today and you think, God, that's an amazing amount of money. But you could buy 10 soldiers for a year for that. And you think how many soldiers it takes to man the Antonine Wall. That's small change for the Roman world.
So I suppose if nothing else, the Antonine Wall tells us that the Romans did realise that they had limits.
Yeah, particularly at this period. They've reached the limits of military power and they turn to diplomacy instead.
Diplomacy or bribery?
Or bribery. Depends which side you're on.
Having paid off the locals, in 162 AD, this mammoth frontier was officially shut down and dismantled. The Romans retreated 100 miles south to Hadrian's Wall, and the turf of the Antonine Wall was left to crumble and decay, leaving the ghostly monument that we see today.
So Ben, do you think the stuff that you've seen from up in the air, has that solved the mystery? Has it explained why this wall was abandoned?
I think the truth is it's probably a combination of factors, isn't it? All conspiring to mean that it doesn't develop in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it could even be Antoninus Pius, the emperor who's commissioned this wall. He's died by now, so it's not so politically embarrassing if the whole thing gets mothballed.
They've got less explaining to do. Remember your grand project? We're abandoning it, you know.
In a way, this was just a massive piece of PR for the new emperor on the block. And when it had done its job, it was quietly taken down.
The Antonine Wall deserves to be remembered. It is a world-class monument that was once the ultimate boundary to one of the greatest civilisations on Earth. But Civilizations come and go, and now it's a sleeping giant lying in the land that the Romans once tried to subjugate. It is a testament to raw ambition and also to the power both of oppression and resilience.